Before the flannel, before the MTV videos, before grunge was even a word, Chris Cornell was just a kid in Seattle with a voice that could stop time and a soul that burned quietly. This is the story of how Soundgarden rose from the underground and how Chris Cornell's haunting brilliance helped shape one of the most important musical movements of the 20th century. Chris Cornell was born in Seattle in 1964, the son of a pharmacist and an accountant. He wasn't your typical rock star in the making. As a child, he was shy, introverted, and deeply anxious. He barely spoke. In fact, by age 9, he had stopped speaking to most people outside of his immediate family. But music was the key. Cornell taught himself to play drums by listening obsessively to the Beatles. He would isolate himself in his basement, listening to albums for hours, developing his ear. His first real break came not with a microphone in his hand, but behind a drum kit. In the early 1980s, before Soundgarden existed, Cornell played drums in a cover band called The Shemps. That's where he met bassist Hiro Yamamoto. But Cornell wasn't just drumming. Privately, he was singing. He had a voice that could go from a whisper to a wail and back again in seconds. And it was Yamamoto who encouraged him to share it. In 1984, the two formed a new band with guitarist Kim Thayil, who had just moved from Chicago to Seattle. They called it Soundgarden, a name inspired by a wind-powered art installation in Magnuson Park called the Soundgarden.
The wind. We're not actually named, there's a sculpture in Seattle, we're not actually named after the sculpture. We liked the name of the sculpture and we thought that it evoked other images besides just a metal sound sculpture for us.
Yeah, besides
an appropriate name.
It had sound and garden as two different words. We sort of made it one word, so it's a completely different thing.
In the earliest lineup, Cornell sang and played drums, but it quickly became clear that he needed to be at the front of the stage. They brought in drummer Scott Sundquist, so Cornell could focus on vocals. That decision would change the trajectory of their sound. Cornell's vocals, soaring, guttural, pained, and operatic, became the band's calling card. Now here's something that isn't often talked about. In the mid-80s, the Seattle scene was weird. It wasn't the grunge mecca yet. The scene was more punk than anything else. Bands like the U-Men, Green River, and Malfunction were experimenting with punk and metal hybrids. Soundgarden stood out because they weren't trying to fit in. They had this Sabbath-like heaviness, but it was filtered through Cornell's almost mystical, poetic sensibility.
Summer nights and long warm days, stolen as the old moon falls.
By 1986, they'd recorded their first songs with legendary indie label Sub Pop. The label would go on to become synonymous with grunge, but at the time, it was still finding its identity. Soundgarden was actually the first grunge band from Seattle to sign to a major label, A&M Records, in 1988. This made them the target of backlash from some of the more purist, underground fans. But Chris didn't care about cool points. He cared about the music.
We're gonna look at what a Seattle audience looks like again. All right. I just spent the last 10 weeks looking at Europeans, so I gotta come home and see everybody. It kind of looked like family. You're all invited for Thanksgiving.
Their first full-length album, Ultra Mega OK, was raw and experimental. And while it didn't catch fire commercially, it earned them a Grammy nomination. But Cornell wasn't satisfied with the production. Years later, he admitted they didn't have the time or the right studio environment to make it sound the way they wanted. He always had high standards, even then. In 1987, tragedy struck Cornell personally. His roommate and close friend Andrew Wood, lead singer of Mother Love Bone, died of a heroin overdose. The loss shattered him. Chris channeled his grief into songwriting. During a break in Soundgarden's schedule, he wrote and recorded an entire tribute album with surviving members of Mother Love Bone. That project became Temple of the Dog. It was a moment of catharsis, and it introduced him to a young unknown singer named Eddie Vedder. You probably know the rest of that story. By 1991, Soundgarden had found their groove. Badmotorfinger was heavier, tighter, more focused, and it hit just as the grunge explosion was beginning. Nirvana's Nevermind came out that same year, and suddenly, all eyes were on Seattle. But Cornell never really fit the mold of the tortured grunge frontman that the media tried to create. Sure, he had the demons, depression, addiction, anxiety, but he also had a discipline and a range that few vocalists in rock could match.
I was the guy that was always on time. I was like the guy that always made sure things got done and that we were doing what we needed to do. You know, I was very responsible, but I was also drinking all the time. And
He treated his voice like an instrument. He was known for warming up for hours before a show. While many of his peers burned out quickly, Cornell was refining his craft. Then came Superunknown in 1994. This was their masterpiece. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts and brought us songs like Black Hole Sun, Fell on Black Days, and Spoon Man. The lyrics were introspective, philosophical, less about rage, more about existential dread and isolation. Cornell later said he was reading Sylvia Plath while writing the album. You can hear it in the words.
One thing that I've actually heard you say in the past is that you were never able to write effectively when you were drinking. And I wonder, why is that, do you think?
But even as Soundgarden reached their peak, the cracks began to show. Cornell struggled with substance abuse. The band had creative tensions. By 1997, Soundgarden broke up. There was no big scandal, no fight. It just unraveled. Cornell went solo, and his first album, Euphoria Morning, was a commercial disappointment but a critical gem. It's full of strange time signatures, subtle instrumentation, and some of his most personal lyrics. Then came Audioslave, a supergroup with the instrumental core of Rage Against the Machine. It was a sonic departure, more polished, more arena rock. But again, Cornell made it work. Songs like a Stone and I Am the Highway showcased his ability to inject soul into hard rock. During this time, he also got clean, remarried, and became a father again. It seemed like a new chapter. In 2010, Soundgarden reunited, and it wasn't a cash grab. They released King Animal in 2012, a powerful record that proved they still had something to say. Cornell had matured, but the fire was still there. And then, in 2017, the unthinkable. After a show in Detroit, Chris Cornell died by suicide.
The music industry is in mourning after the shocking death of Chris Cornell, the iconic rocker who fronted Soundgarden and Audioslave.
The rock world was stunned. It didn't make sense. He had seemed healthy, happy. But as those close to him later said, Cornell struggled with mental health his whole life. Fame didn't fix that. Success didn't erase it. And yet what he left behind is staggering. A voice that could stretch 5 octaves, lyrics that cut to the bone, a band that helped birth a genre, and a legacy that refuses to fade. Soundgarden wasn't just a grunge band. Chris Cornell wasn't just a frontman. They were visionaries, architects of a sound that captured a generation's disillusionment and beauty. And it all started with a quiet kid in a Seattle basement, playing Beatles records and waiting for the courage to sing. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the early days of Soundgarden and the genius of Chris Cornell, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment on who you want to hear about next.